welcome. You have been told that Halloween is a night for children, a harmless masquerade of ghosts and goblins where the only real danger is a stomach ache from too much candy. This is a comforting lie, a sweet confection designed to mask a bitter and ancient truth. You have been taught that the traditions, the costumes, the jack-o'-lanterns are quaint customs from a simpler time. The reality is that they were never celebrations. They were desperate acts of defense, flimsy shields against the suffocating dark. For one night, a year, on the eve of Samhain, the barrier between our warm, well-lit world and the cold, eternal hunger of the other world wears thin. It becomes a porous membrane, and through it, the things we have tried so hard to forget are free to walk again. They do not come for treats. They come to hunt. Our story is about a woman who believed only in what she could measure, a woman for whom history was a set of footnotes, and folklore was a collection of dead metaphors. Her name was Alara Vance, a brilliant and respected American folklorist whose entire career was built upon the sterile dissection of belief. Her purpose was not to understand magic, but to expose it as a psychological crutch for the ignorant. This intellectual arrogance was her shield, her identity, and her most profound vulnerability. She saw the world as a text to be deconstructed, a puzzle to be solved, and she was certain she held all the pieces. She sought to prove that the shadows held nothing but the absence of light, a fatal miscalculation for someone about to step into a darkness that was very, very full. She had come to a forgotten corner of rural Ireland, a place that felt perpetually damp, where the air itself seemed to be a heavy gray quilt woven from mist, peat smoke, and centuries of unspoken fear. The village was a huddled collection of stone cottages, clinging to the hillside as if for protection, their windows like wary eyes staring out into the encroaching wilderness. The smell of wet earth was omnipresent, a constant reminder of the graves that lay just beneath the surface of the green landscape. Even in the local pub, the laughter was muted, and conversations would die whenever an outsider entered. The people here did not simply live with their history, they were haunted by it, their lives dictated by warnings passed down through generations like grim heirlooms. The locals spoke of Samhain not with festive anticipation, but with a quiet, resigned dread. They warned her, their faces etched with a sincerity her academic mind dismissed as charmingly primitive. Stay indoors, they insisted. Bar the doors and do not answer any call from the night, no matter how familiar the voice. Above all, they warned her away from the Drombeg altar, the unhallowed stone circle that sat upon the moor like a set of broken teeth. It was a place, they said, where the veil was not just thin, but entirely absent, a gaping wound between worlds. Ilara listened, smiled, and took copious notes, cataloging their fears as fascinating artifacts of a dying culture, completely deaf to the genuine terror that fueled their pleas. And so, as the sun bled out across the horizon, painting the bruised sky in shades of violet and orange, Ilara made her choice. Driven by a supreme act of hubris, she buttoned her coat against the biting wind and began the hike toward the forbidden circle. Her goal was simple: to spend the night at the heart of their superstition and document the profound, undeniable emptiness of it all. Upon reaching the monolithic stones, which seemed to drink the remaining light from the sky, she felt a thrill of intellectual victory. She pulled a worn, leather-bound journal from her bag, found the passage she was looking for, and with a small, mocking smile, began to recite an ancient warding charm. Her voice, clear and confident, was an academic exercise, a deliberate profanity against the sacred dread of the locals, and an open invitation to whatever was listening. The final word of the charm left her lips and was immediately devoured by an absolute and profound silence. It was not the gentle quiet of a remote countryside, but a heavy, pressurized nullity, as if a thick blanket had been thrown over the world, smothering every last vibration. The chirping of crickets, the rustle of wind through the heather, even the sound of her own breathing, all of it was gone. She stood in a vacuum, the world suddenly a photograph instead of a living place. Her academic mind scrambled for an explanation, an acoustic anomaly, a pressure change, but the visceral wrongness of the stillness settled deep in her bones. This was not an absence of sound. It was the active presence of silence, a deliberate and predatory hush that was listening intently for the frantic beating of her heart. Then the air moved. It was not a breeze, but a cold, purposeful current that coiled around the stone circle, seeming to originate from nowhere and everywhere at once. It carried with it a scent that her logical mind could not immediately place, a complex and nauseating bouquet of freshly turned grave soil, damp rotted leaves, and something else, something metallic and vaguely sweet, like old blood. The cold was no longer just the chill of an autumn night. It was a penetrating, invasive cold that seeped through the layers of her clothing and into her very marrow. It was the cold of the tomb, a cold that didn't just numb the skin, but seemed to extinguish the warmth of life itself, and it clung to her like a wet shroud. Within that spectral wind, the whispers began. At first, they were indistinct, a sibilant, multi-layered hissing like sand scouring bone. But then, a single word crystallized from the cacophony, a word she knew better than any other, her own name, Elara. It was not spoken. It was exhaled by 1,000 decaying throats, stretched and distorted, mocking and hungry. Her blood ran cold. She tried to rationalize it as auditory pareidolia, her mind playing tricks on her in the eerie quiet. But the sound was too clear, too intimate. It was as if the night itself knew her, had been waiting for her, and was now savoring the taste of her name on its collective bodiless tongue before the feast began in earnest. A fog, thick as clotted cream and unnaturally gray, began to pour over the edges of the moor, rolling not with the slow pace of weather, but with the speed of a rushing tide. It surged into the stone circle, swallowing the landscape and shrinking Ilara's world to a suffocatingly small bubble of visibility. The monolithic stones became vague, looming shapes in the periphery, and the stars were blotted out one by one. Sound, which had been absent, now returned, but it was distorted, the whisper of her own clothing seeming unnaturally loud, the frantic thumping of her pulse a deafening drum against her ribs. The fog was a cage, a sensory deprivation chamber designed to isolate her, to make her the sole focus of whatever was now unfolding on this unhallowed stage. A sudden, violent crack of lightning split the oppressive gloom, a silent, actinic flash that bleached the world white for a single, eternal second. In that stark, overexposed moment, she saw him. Across the circle, huddled against one of the great stones, was the figure of a man. He was gaunt and pale, dressed in the simple, rough-spun clothes of a local farmer. His face was turned away, his body curled in on itself as if to ward off the unnatural chill. A flicker of relief, insane as it was, shot through her. She was not alone. Before a word could form on her lips, Before she could even process the image, the world was plunged back into absolute blackness. The after-image of the lonely figure burned onto her retinas. The darkness that followed the flash was deeper, more absolute, but it was not empty. A sound tore through the silence, a sickening symphony of wet cracks and pops like celery being snapped in a dozen places at once. Another flash of lightning illuminated the scene, and the sight that met Alara's eyes would forever shatter the foundations of her rational world. The man was on his feet, but his limbs were bent at impossible, horrifying angles, his spine contorted into a broken arch, his jaw unhinged with a nauseating tearing sound, stretching his mouth into a cavernous, silent scream as his eyes rolled back, white and stark. He was not moving of his own volition. He was a marionette whose strings were being violently pulled by an unseen, malevolent hand. Before the thunder could even follow the lightning, a tempest of motion erupted from the sky above him. It was a torrent of screeching bird-like shadows, a swarm of indistinct skeletal shapes that moved with the fluid chaos of a murmuration of starlings, but with the predatory intent of piranha. They descended upon the broken figure in a flurry of motion, their forms coalescing for a moment to reveal emaciated limbs and eyes that burned like cold, red embers. There was a sound like 1,000 hooked talons tearing through wet fabric, and something softer beneath. The man was lifted from his feet, his silent scream finally finding a voice in a single, choked-off gurgle as he was violently yanked upward into the churning, shadowy vortex, and then, simply, was gone. The academic died in that moment. The cynical folklorist, the dispassionate observer, all of it was flayed from her soul, leaving behind only the raw, gibbering animal. A scream, shrill and ragged, finally clawed its way out of her constricted throat. A pathetic sound, immediately swallowed by the shrieking gale that now whipped through the circle. She didn't think. She reacted. Turning her back on the horrifying emptiness where the man had been, she scrambled away, plunging blindly into the gnarled trees that bordered the moor. Her only thought was flight, a desperate, instinctual need to put as much distance as possible between herself and the ravenous, impossible thing that had just unfolded before her eyes. The hunt had begun, and she was now the prey. She ran with the wild, unthinking panic of a cornered animal, thorns and low-hanging branches lashing at her face and tearing at her clothes. The forest floor was a treacherous carpet of slick roots and unseen hollows, but she barely noticed the stumbles or the searing pain in her lungs. Every shadow seemed to coalesce into a grasping talon. Every gust of wind carried the echoes of that terrible screeching. The path she had taken to the circle, once so clear in the fading daylight, was utterly gone, replaced by a bewildering labyrinth of ancient, twisted oaks and skeletal hawthorns. The very woods seemed to have rearranged themselves, their purpose no longer natural but malevolent, designed to confuse and ensnare. The forest itself had become her enemy. The trees seemed to lean in as she passed, their branches like skeletal fingers eager to snag her hair and clothing. The ground beneath her feet felt unstable, shifting, as if she were running across the back of some great, sleeping beast. Logic and direction ceased to have meaning. Every instinct screamed that she was moving away from the circle, deeper into the woods, and toward the distant, theoretical safety of the village. Yet, after what felt like an eternity of desperate, frantic running, she burst through a thicket of grasping briars and stumbled into a clearing. Her heart seized in her chest, a cold, hard knot of pure despair. She was back where she started. The great, silent stones of the Drombeg altar loomed before her, waiting patiently like ancient, silent judges. The whispers returned, but they were different now. They were no longer carried on the wind, but were being piped directly into the theater of her mind. They bypassed her ears entirely, blooming from within her own consciousness like a toxic fungus, and they no longer just spoke her name. They began to dismantle her piece by piece, using her own memories as their weapons. They spoke of her academic rivals, whispering how they all considered her a fraud. They conjured the image of her lonely childhood, the sting of being chosen last for every game, every insecurity, every private failure, every secret shame was excavated and laid bare, their voices a chorus of her own self-doubt, amplified to an unbearable, soul-crushing volume. Then came the visions. They were not memories, but terrifying premonitions, flashed against the inside of her eyelids with blinding clarity. She saw her own body, pale and broken, lying at the center of the circle, her limbs twisted into the same unnatural parody of life she had just witnessed. She saw shadowy talons peeling the skin from her bones, her eyes wide with a terror that transcended mere death. She felt the phantom sensation of her soul being ripped from her flesh, a cold, tearing agony that left an emptiness far more profound than any physical pain. The Sluag were not just hunting her body. They were systematically breaking her spirit, ensuring she was already defeated long before they made their final, physical move. It was then, at the absolute nadir of her hope, that she saw it. Through a gap in the skeletal trees, far across the boggy expanse of the moor, a single point of warm yellow light flickered. A cottage, a window, a lamp lit against the encroaching dark. It was a beacon of impossible warmth and safety in the suffocating coldness of her nightmare. The sight was a jolt of pure, unadulterated adrenaline, a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Civilization, people, sanctuary. The whispers in her head momentarily receded, overshadowed by a new, primal command that pulsed through her veins. Reach the light. Hope, that most cruel and resilient of human traits, flared to life within her shattered psyche. She launched herself from the relative safety of the trees, her legs pumping with a strength born of sheer desperation. The ground was soft and treacherous, the boggy earth sucking at her boots with a greedy, wet sound, threatening to pull her down with every step. She ignored it, her eyes fixed on that solitary, welcoming light. It was her entire world, the singular focus of her existence. The cold mud and grasping reeds were nothing. The lingering terror was nothing. All that mattered was closing the distance, feeling the rough wood of a door beneath her knuckles, hearing the sound of a human voice that was not a tormenting whisper. The light seemed to grow brighter, beckoning her onward, promising an end to the horror. She was getting closer. She could almost make out the shape of the cottage, a dark silhouette against the turbulent sky. But something was wrong. The light didn't illuminate its surroundings. It didn't spill from a window or cast long shadows. It simply hung in the air, a single, isolated flame, flickering and dancing with an eerie, unnatural stillness. As she stumbled to a halt at the edge of a pool of black, stagnant water, the terrible, folklore-steeped truth crashed down upon her. It was not a lamp. It was a corp and solace, a corpse candle, a will-o'-the-wisp, an ethereal light said to float over the bogs, luring unwary travelers to a watery grave. The fragile ember of hope she had nurtured was not just extinguished, It was drenched in icy black despair. The light had not been a promise of salvation. It had been a lure, another exquisitely cruel trick in the psychological warfare being waged against her. She stood, trembling and exhausted, at the edge of the deep bog, the treacherous ground all around her. The whispers in her head returned, no longer mocking, but laughing. A low, dry, rustling chuckle from 1,000 throats. They had played with her. They had dangled the prospect of safety before her, only to reveal the gaping maw of another, more mundane death. And they had savored every second of her frantic, hopeful flight. As if summoned by her despair, they descended, not in a sudden rush, but with a terrifying deliberation. The shadows in the canopy of the surrounding woods deepened and began to coalesce, dripping down from the branches like thick black tar. The storm of bird-like figures materialized from the fog, their forms more distinct now, a swirling vortex of skeletal limbs, tattered cloaks, and countless pairs of burning, malevolent eyes. They formed a silent, tightening perimeter around her, cutting off any path of retreat. She was trapped, her back to the deadly bog, her front to the impossible, ravenous host. The game was over. The trap had been sprung. She scrambled backward, away from the encroaching line of shadows, until her back hit the cold, hard reality of one of the standing stones of the circle. She had been herded, driven like a lamb back to the slaughtering pen. She was precisely where they wanted her. Her breath came in ragged, shallow gasps, each one a painful reminder of her own fragile mortality. The air grew thick and heavy, the pressure dropping so intensely that her ears popped. She was at the center of the storm, the focal point of an ancient and insatiable hunger. Her body braced for the tearing, the agony, the end she had been shown in the visions. But the attack did not come. The Sluagh held their position, a silent watching ring of horrors. The shrieking wind died down once more, replaced by the insidious, intimate chorus of whispers that now felt like a permanent part of her own thoughts. The physical threat receded, replaced by a psychological pressure that was infinitely worse. They were not simply going to devour her. That was too simple, too quick. They intended to break something deeper first, to force a choice, to corrupt her soul before they consumed it. This was not a hunt for flesh. She finally understood. It was a hunt for damnation. A new vision bloomed in her mind, so vivid and clear it blotted out the terrifying tableau before her. It was not a horror, but a simple domestic scene. A small, sparsely furnished room in one of the village cottages. In a simple wooden bed, a young child, a boy no older than 7, tossed and turned, his face flushed with fever. A damp cloth was plastered to his forehead, and his breathing was shallow and ragged. Above his bed, hanging from a nail on the wall, was a small, crudely woven charm of straw and red thread, a protective ward, a fragile, hopeful piece of superstition standing guard over a fragile, flickering life. She understood with a chilling and intuitive certainty what the whispers were showing her. The child was weak, his life force already diminished by illness. The ward that protected him was a product of faith, a barrier woven from belief. But belief, she knew all too well, was a fragile thing. The whispers slithered through her thoughts, showing her how simple it would be. All she would have to do was renounce the charm's power, to use her own disbelief, her academic certainty that such things were meaningless, as a weapon, to mentally reach out and shatter the child's flimsy shield, leaving him utterly exposed and vulnerable to the hungry things in the night. The bargain was laid bare, not in words, but in a wave of pure transactional understanding that flooded her consciousness, the child's soul for her own. A simple exchange. They were a force of nature, like a river seeking the path of least resistance. The boy was an easier target, a more vulnerable soul, if only his protections could be stripped away. They offered her a way out. They would let her walk away from this circle, back to the village, back to her life. All she had to do was point them toward weaker prey. All she had to do was sacrifice an innocent, anonymous child on the altar of her own survival. And for a terrible, eternal moment, she considered it. The scholar was gone. The rationalist was a ghost. All that was left was the raw, terrified animal cowering at the base of the stone, desperate to live for one more second, one more breath. The face of the child, a stranger, blurred in her mind, becoming an abstraction, his life versus hers. The cold, brutal calculus of survival took hold. The whispers grew louder, more persuasive, showing her the morning sun, the warmth of a fire, the taste of food, all the simple, beautiful things she would have again if she would only make this one simple choice. The taste of bile rose in her throat. This, then, was the final horror. Not the shadowy monsters that circled her, but the reflection of the monster they were showing her in the dark mirror of her own soul. The true abyss was not the churning vortex of the sluagh, but the possibility that she would agree to their terms. The terror was not that she was going to die, but that she might choose to live at such an unforgivable cost. To save her own life, she would have to become a predator herself, an active participant in their ancient, gruesome hunt. The choice was before her, to die as Alara Vance, or to live as something utterly and irredeemably damned. The image of the feverish child solidified in her mind, his small face a battlefield of innocence and illness. In that moment, something within Alara, something more profound than the instinct for survival, snapped into place. It was the last battered remnant of her humanity, of empathy. To save herself by sacrificing him would not be living. It would be a state of damnation far worse than being torn apart by the sluagh. She saw the two paths with perfect, terrifying clarity. A quick, clean death, or an eternal life of monstrosity. The choice, which a moment ago had seemed so complex, became brutally simple. Her arrogance had led her here, had opened the door to this evil. It was her debt to pay, not the child's. A silent scream of defiance erupted in her mind, a resounding no. That was not just a refusal of their bargain, but a rejection of the pathetic, terrified creature she had almost become. It was an act of rebellion against her own base instincts. She would not be their instrument. She would not be their accomplice. This raw, explosive act of will pushed back against the tide of whispers, creating a momentary pocket of silence in her own head. In that brief, precious clarity, she remembered the words she had spoken in mockery such a short time ago, the ancient charm from her journal. The words that had started it all would now be the only thing to end it. Her lips, cracked and trembling, formed the ancient Gaelic syllables. The first time, her voice had been a tool of academic inquiry, clean and detached. Now it was a ragged, desperate rasp, torn from the very depths of her soul. The words were no longer just sounds. They were imbued with the full, terrifying weight of her belief. She was not reciting a historical text. She was praying to a power she had spent her life denying, a power she now understood was terrifyingly, undeniably real. Every ounce of her fear, her regret, and her desperate final act of human decency was poured into the incantation, transforming the dead letters into a living, breathing force. This was the key the Sluagh had overlooked. The charm was not a shield. It was not a weapon of banishment. It was an offering, an ancient pact that required a sacrifice, and its power was directly proportional to the conviction of the speaker. Her initial mocking recitation had been an empty invitation. This new prayer, however, screamed with the absolute, unshakable belief of a soul staring into the abyss. It was an offering of the only thing she had left to give, herself. The raw, primal energy of her terrified faith flared out into the night, a beacon of pure, concentrated soul stuff that was irresistible to the ancient magic sleeping in the earth beneath her feet. The Sluagh recoiled, not in fear, but in something akin to surprise. They shrieked in frustration as a new power, far older and more elemental than their own ravenous hunger, began to stir. They had been cheated. The soul they had so carefully cornered and prepared was now being offered to another, to the land itself. The very stones of the circle began to hum, a low, resonant frequency that vibrated through the soles of Alara's boots and up into her bones. A cold, phosphorescent blue-white light began to bleed from within the ancient monoliths, not illuminating the fog, but cutting through it, casting long, stark shadows that writhed and danced as if alive. She felt an impossible, irresistible force take hold of her. It was not the grasping talons of the Sluagh, but a gravitational pull emanating from the very center of the circle. The earth was claiming its due. The ancient pact had been invoked, and the price had been accepted. She was dragged from her position against the stone, her feet scraping uselessly against the damp soil as she was pulled inch by agonizing inch toward the circle's epicenter. The blue light intensified, converging at the point where she was being drawn, the air crackling with a power that felt like the birth of a star and the cold of a grave combined. The light enveloped her completely, a searing, freezing fire that incinerated her physical form. The pain was absolute, a supernova of agony that burned away her flesh, her bones, her name, her history. Everything she had been, every memory, every thought was atomized in that terrible, holy light. But it was her scream that underwent the most profound transformation. It started as a human cry of pain and terror, but as her body dissolved, the sound was stripped of its mortal timbre, stretching and thinning until it became something else entirely, a keening, ethereal wail, the pure sound of sorrow and loss woven into the very fabric of the wind. When the light faded, the circle was empty. Alara Vance was gone. The fog slowly receded, and the oppressive silence was broken by the familiar natural sounds of the night. The Sluagh, cheated of their prize and unwilling to contest the claim of the land itself, had vanished back into the thinning veil, their hungry whispers fading into the shriek of the ordinary wind. The hunt was over for this year. The ancient evil had not been defeated, merely sated by the raw, sacrificial energy it had been offered. The terrible balance had been maintained, but a new and permanent scar had been carved upon the landscape. Alara did not die, not truly. Her consciousness remained, but it was fractured and untethered from human form, eternally bound to the stones and the soil of that unhallowed place. She became a part of the circle's dread, an echo of the sacrifice made. She was now its spectral guardian, a prisoner of the very magic that had saved her. She could feel the slow, patient turning of the earth, the changing of the seasons, the waxing and waning of the moon. Time ceased to be a linear progression and became a vast repeating cycle, always turning back toward the one night that now defined her entire existence, Samhain. And so, years later, on a windswept October night, the story told in the village had changed. The old fears remained. The doors were still barred, the children kept close. But a new layer had been added to the grim tapestry of local lore. They no longer spoke only of the Sluagh, of the ravenous host that rides the autumn gales. They now looked to the moor with a different kind of fear, a more intimate dread, and they listened for a new sound that had been added to the night's symphony of terror. They listened for the cry of the woman who had been lost to the stones. They called her the Cowan-Eag, the Wailing Woman, a new spirit born of modern arrogance and ancient power. The villagers whisper that on Samhain Eve, if the wind is just right, you can hear her cry drifting down from the moor. It is a sound of pure, unending grief, a lament for the life, the warmth, and the humanity she sacrificed. It is a scream that is both a memory of her own terror and a desperate warning to any who, like her, would be foolish enough to treat the old ways as mere superstition and walk out into the dark, believing they have nothing to fear. Her wail serves as a chilling reminder that the veil is always ready to tear, and that the things that wait on the other side are patient and eternal. The evil was not vanquished that night. It was merely fed. The price of one child's life and the lives of the villagers was the creation of a new and permanent horror, a ghost forever trapped between the world she sought to debunk and the nightmare that proved her so terribly wrong. Her arrogance was the key that unlocked the cage, and her sacrifice became the new lock. With her own soul trapped inside, she is still there in the cold heart of the stone circle, a wailing sentinel, a monument to a cursed victory. She is the proof that some truths are not meant to be uncovered, and that some doors are better left unopened. The world of logic and reason is a thin, fragile crust over a deep, dark ocean of primal forces that do not care for our understanding. They only care for the old rules, the old pacts, and the taste of a soul offered up in absolute terrified belief. So, when you see the smiling masks and the plastic skeletons, remember what they were truly meant for. They are a flimsy wall, a child's drawing of a fortress, intended to ward off a reality too terrible to acknowledge. The truth of Samhain is not in the candy and costumes, but in the howling of the wind, in the oppressive dark between the streetlights, and in the story of the woman who became a scream. Now you know.